Marcus Hale stepped onto the private jet quietly while his wife's family laughed and joked as if he did not exist. What none of them knew was that the jet they were boarding, the leather seats they bragged about, the champagne they raised all belonged to him, and before the flight reached cruising altitude, every drop of water they poured on him would come back with consequences they never imagined. Marcus Hale moved down the narrow jet walkway with calm measured steps, even though every laugh behind him landed like a quiet slap against his back. He wore a simple navy suit that blended into the cabin instead of announcing wealth and power the way the others preferred. His wife's family filled the jet with loud voices and careless confidence, speaking about business deals, vacations and influence as if the world bent naturally around them. No one looked at Marcus as the owner of the aircraft they were stepping into. They looked at him as the husband who married above his station. The man who kept quiet at dinners. The man whose success they assumed was borrowed from proximity rather than built from discipline and vision. From the moment they boarded, the energy made it clear this flight was not about celebration but dominance. Laughter erupted before anyone sat down. Champagne bottles popped with exaggerated flair. Phones came out immediately to record luxury for social media captions that would never mention the real source of the privilege. Marcus took the seat nearest the aisle not because it was assigned but because he chose to observe rather than participate. His wife Selena barely acknowledged him as she took her seat across the aisle beside her mother. She was radiant tonight, dressed in silk and confidence, energized by her family's approval. Approval she had chased for years. Approval that always came with conditions. Marcus watched her laugh with her sister while her mother leaned across the aisle speaking loudly about how far Selena had come. The mother's voice cut through the cabin deliberately. "Some people are lucky enough to marry into opportunity," she said, smiling without warmth. "Others spend their lives hoping to be noticed." Several family members chuckled. Marcus did not react. He had learned long ago that silence unsettled people more than arguments ever could. As the jet doors closed, the flight attendant greeted the group warmly. She glanced briefly at Marcus and nodded with professional respect. That nod did not go unnoticed by Selena's father, who frowned immediately. "Why is she greeting him like that?" he muttered. "Probably mistakes him for staff," Selena's brother replied, laughing. "He does have that quiet worker look." Marcus folded his hands calmly. He remembered the day he purchased the jet through a holding company that carried none of his personal branding. He remembered insisting the crew treat all guests equally regardless of perceived status. He remembered choosing discretion over ego every single time. The engines powered up and the vibration traveled through the cabin. Selena's mother stood up holding a glass of water instead of champagne. She lifted it theatrically and spoke loudly. "A toast," she announced. "To family success and knowing your place in life." She paused and looked directly at Marcus. Her smile sharpened. "And to those who benefit from our generosity." Before Marcus could even shift in his seat, she tipped the glass forward. Cold water splashed across his chest and suit, soaking the fabric and dripping onto the leather seat beneath him. Gasps filled the cabin, followed by laughter. Phones lifted higher, capturing the moment from multiple angles. Selena froze, her smile flickering uncertainly, but she said nothing. Marcus looked down at the spreading water across his jacket, then back up slowly. His face remained composed. His voice remained steady. "Is everyone finished?" he asked quietly. That question only fueled the mockery. Selena's brother leaned forward, pointing and laughing. "Look at him," he said. "Did you think this was your jet?" Another glass followed. Then another. Water splashed against his shoulders, his collar, his face. Marcus closed his eyes briefly, not in humiliation but calculation. The jet began taxiing toward the runway. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard. We will be departing shortly." Marcus raised his head and spoke calmly. "Captain, please hold position." The laughter stopped instantly. The flight attendant stiffened. Selena's father stood up angrily. "Who do you think you are, barking orders?" he snapped. Marcus stood slowly, water dripping from his sleeves onto the carpet. He adjusted his cuffs deliberately and looked around the cabin, making eye contact with each person. "I am the reason this jet exists. I am the reason this flight is happening and I am the man you just publicly humiliated. Silence swallowed the cabin. Selina laughed nervously. Stop it, Marcus, this isn't funny. Marcus turned to her calmly. It was never meant to be funny. The intercom crackled again. Captain here requesting confirmation, sir. Marcus straightened his posture. This is Marcus Hale, owner of Hale Aeronautics and the registered owner of this aircraft. Lock the doors and bring legal and security on board immediately. The cabin exploded into chaos. What did he say? Is this a joke? Someone tell him to stop. Selina's mother's face drained of color. Her glass slipped from her hand, shattering on the floor. Marcus remained standing steady, grounded as the truth settled into the air heavier than the jet fuel outside. And that was only the beginning. The cabin felt smaller the moment Marcus finished speaking, as if the walls themselves leaned inward to listen. Every breath became loud and exposed, and every person suddenly aware that arrogance had nowhere left to hide. Selina stood frozen between loyalty and disbelief, her mind scrambling to rewrite years of assumptions that no longer fit. Her father was the first to speak, but the confidence in his voice had evaporated. You cannot be serious, Marcus, this is some kind of power play gone too far. We paid for this flight, we have the receipts. Marcus turned slowly, letting the silence stretch long enough to drain the room of bravado. Receipts are paper, he said calmly. Ownership is registered with aviation authorities and backed by corporate filings and federal documentation. The flight attendant moved with quiet urgency toward the cockpit, her tone respectful and firm. Captain, security is being notified per owner request. The word owner landed hard. It echoed in every mind, replaying every insult, every laugh, every careless splash of water. Selina's mother backed into her seat, gripping the armrest as if turbulence had already begun. This is ridiculous, she snapped, but her voice trembled. If you owned this jet, we would know. People like you do not just own things like this. Marcus looked at her steadily, without anger, without triumph. People like me, he repeated softly. People who build quietly while others perform loudly. Selina stepped forward, her heels clicking against the cabin floor. Marcus, why did you never say anything, she asked, her voice cracking between confusion and fear. Why let this go on? He looked at her with something heavier than disappointment. Because I wanted to see who you all were when you thought no one important was watching. Her brother scoffed, trying to regain control. This is all talk, he said, pulling out his phone. I will call my attorney right now. Before he could unlock the screen, the cabin door at the rear opened. Two uniformed security officers stepped inside, followed by a sharply dressed woman holding a tablet and credentials. The atmosphere shifted from mockery to reality in a single breath. Good evening, she said, addressing Marcus directly. I am corporate counsel for Hale Aeronautics. We received your request and have confirmed your identity. She turned toward the stunned family. This aircraft is privately owned and unauthorized harassment of the owner constitutes a federal aviation offense. Selina's mother stood abruptly. This is outrageous, she shouted. We are guests, we were celebrating. Celebrating does not include assault, the counsel replied evenly. Multiple recorded angles confirm intentional acts. Phones lowered slowly. Hands trembled. Laughter vanished as quickly as it had come. Selina's father sat down heavily, his face pale. Marcus, we are family, he said quietly now. There must be another way to handle this. Marcus nodded once, acknowledging the statement without accepting it. Family does not humiliate. Family does not pour water on dignity and laugh. The jet remained grounded, engines silent now like a held breath. Outside, flashing lights approached the tarmac, reflecting against the windows. Selina's sister began to cry softly, mascara streaking down her cheeks. We did not know, she whispered. We thought. You thought wealth was loud, Marcus replied. You thought power needed to announce itself. He turned toward Selina, his voice lowering. I asked for respect, not worship. I tolerated jokes, not cruelty. Tonight crossed a line. She reached for his arm instinctively, but he stepped back, creating space that felt wider than the cabin itself. Security approached Selina's mother first. "Ma'am, we need you to step aside for questioning." Her mouth opened but no sound came. For the first time in her life, authority did not bend to her tone. Selina's brother tried to protest and was immediately restrained. The sound of cuffs closing snapped something final into place. Marcus addressed the room one last time before stepping toward the exit. "This flight is cancelled. This relationship is under review. And the consequences will be handled without spectacle." As he walked off the jet, the cool night air met his soaked suit. Flashing lights illuminated the runway. Behind him, the family that once laughed now sat fractured and silent. And somewhere between the echo of sirens and the quiet resolve in his steps, the truth finally landed. Power never needed their permission. Morning arrived without sleep for anyone involved, as news traveled faster than apologies ever could. Phones vibrated relentlessly across the city with messages, headlines and whispers reshaping reputations before breakfast. By sunrise, the story was already framed not as an accident but as a revelation. Security footage from the jet leaked within hours. Water splashing. Laughter ringing. A man standing still while dignity absorbed humiliation. Commentators dissected body language frame by frame. The calm posture. The restraint. The moment silence replaced mockery. Marcus Hale became a name spoken with curiosity first, then respect. Profiles surfaced describing a quiet investor who avoided interviews and refused awards. A man who funded projects anonymously and signed documents through trusts. The phrase silent ownership trended by noon. So did private jet humiliation. Selina woke alone on the edge of the guest room bed, staring at the wall. Her phone lay face down after she read the final message from Marcus sent at dawn. "We will talk when clarity replaces shock." Her parents gathered in the living room downstairs, voices low and strained. For the first time, no one dominated the conversation. Every sentence ended in uncertainty. "We did not know," her father repeated. "We never knew." "Knowing would not have changed how you treated him," her sister replied quietly. "Only what you expected from him." That truth cut deeper than the scandal. It reframed years of behavior, dinners, jokes, comments framed as humor but rooted in assumption. Meanwhile, legal teams moved swiftly. Statements were prepared. Flights cancelled. Accounts frozen pending investigation into assault aboard a private aircraft. Marcus sat in a conference room surrounded by advisors who spoke carefully around him. They expected fury. They expected vengeance. Instead, he asked a single question. "What did this reveal?" One advisor hesitated, then answered honestly. "It revealed character. Not yours but theirs." Marcus nodded. "Then we respond with truth, not noise." By afternoon he released a brief statement. No insults. No accusations. Only confirmation of ownership and a request for privacy. That restraint amplified the story more than outrage ever could. Public sympathy surged. Support poured in from leaders who recognized themselves in his silence. Selina arrived at his office unannounced that evening, escorted quietly past reception. She looked smaller, without confidence cushioning her steps. Marcus stood when she entered, not as courtesy but habit. They faced each other across a desk that had never separated them before. "Why did you marry me?" she asked suddenly. Her voice raw and exposed. He answered without hesitation. "Because you listened when I spoke. You believed before you knew. Or at least I thought you did." Tears slipped free as she looked down. "I became someone else around them," she whispered. "I let them define value." Marcus leaned back, breathing slowly. "That is what hurt. Not the water. Not the laughter. But your silence." She reached for his hand again. This time he did not pull away, but he did not close the distance either. "I need time," he said quietly. "Time to see if accountability exists beyond embarrassment." Outside the building, cameras waited hungry for reaction. Inside, the space between them held more weight than headlines ever could. Selina left without answers. Without certainty. Only understanding that love tested by power revealed truth. Across town, her family faced consequences one by one. Sponsors withdrew. Social invitations disappeared. Their names became shorthand for arrogance exposed. No apology restored what had been stripped away. No explanation softened public judgment. They learned what Marcus always knew. That ownership was not about assets. It was about self-control. As night fell, Marcus stood alone looking out over the city. Lights shimmered indifferent to status. Buildings rose without asking permission. He removed his watch, set it down and exhaled. For the first time since the jet. He felt light. Because the truth no longer hid. And neither would he. The following week unfolded like a slow, controlled earthquake that shifted foundations rather than collapsing buildings. Every morning brought new consequences, and every evening revealed another layer of truth that could no longer be hidden. Marcus chose visibility, not spectacle. He attended meetings in person. He signed documents with his own name. He answered questions without drama. Executives who once overlooked him now waited respectfully outside glass offices, rehearsing words they wished they had used earlier. Employees who never knew the owner walked past him daily, now realizing the man they nodded to quietly had always been watching. The jet incident became a case study in corporate ethics seminars and leadership workshops. Slides showed still frames of laughter followed by silence. Instructors asked what restraint looked like under pressure. Marcus Hale became the answer without needing to speak. Selina tried again to reach him through letters instead of messages. Each envelope contained accountability rather than excuses. She wrote about complicity. She wrote about silence. She wrote about fear of standing alone against family expectations. Marcus read every word without interruption. He did not respond immediately because growth required time to breathe. Meanwhile, her family faced a reckoning that no apology could reverse. Contracts were terminated quietly. Charity boards requested resignations without explanation. Invitations stopped arriving. They discovered that reputation once damaged did not heal through denial. Only humility could begin repair. At a closed-door mediation meeting arranged by legal counsel, her parents finally faced Marcus directly. There were no raised voices. No accusations. Her father spoke first, hands folded tightly as if gripping pride. "We treated you as invisible because it made us comfortable." Marcus nodded slowly. Comfort built on ignorance always collapses. Her mother wept openly. "We thought power announced itself loudly," she said. "We did not recognize restraint." Marcus stood then, not in anger but resolve. "This meeting is not about forgiveness. It is about acknowledgement." They nodded, understanding too late but understanding nonetheless. Outside those walls the public conversation shifted from scandal to introspection. People debated how often assumptions shaped behavior. How wealth was measured by noise rather than impact. Marcus funded a scholarship quietly for young leaders focused on ethical authority. No press release. No ceremony. Just opportunity. Selina watched from a distance, respecting the boundary he set. She attended counseling. She confronted family dynamics she had avoided. She learned how silence could be louder than cruelty. Weeks passed. Then months. The jet was sold not because of shame but because Marcus no longer needed symbols. He flew commercial without announcement. Sat among strangers. Observed humanity without hierarchy. One evening he invited Selina to walk with him along the river. No lawyers. No agendas. They spoke about who they were before expectations rewrote them. They acknowledged wounds without rushing closure. "I am not asking for restoration," she said softly. "Only honesty." Marcus looked out over the water, reflecting city lights. Honesty is the beginning, not the promise. They parted with respect rather than resolution. Both changed. Both awake. The story faded from headlines, replaced by louder scandals and newer outrage. But the lesson lingered quietly in boardrooms, families, and private conversations. Because humiliation revealed truth. But restraint revealed character. Marcus returned home alone that night, not lonely but centered. He had reclaimed something more valuable than reputation. He had reclaimed authorship of his own narrative. The months that followed carried a slower, heavier weight than the initial shock because consequences matured quietly long after cameras turned away. Marcus Hale continued moving through the world with deliberate calm, choosing consistency over reaction and patience over display. Every decision he made after the jet incident was measured against one question: whether it preserved dignity rather than dominance. He restructured his aviation company not as punishment but as principle, introducing conduct standards that prioritized respect, accountability, and restraint. Crew training expanded to include authority boundaries and incident response protocols that centered de-escalation rather than spectacle. Legal counsel reviewed policies across subsidiaries, ensuring ownership did not create entitlement and proximity never excused behavior. The industry responded with interest rather than outrage because leaders recognized the difference between power exercised loudly and power exercised wisely. Executives requested private briefings asking how Marcus maintained control without public confrontation. He answered simply, saying clarity removed the need for conflict. Selena's family felt the long arc of consequence stretch into their daily lives where privilege once smoothed everything. Financial partners reconsidered relationships, citing reputational risk and ethical alignment. Long-standing social memberships quietly lapsed without explanation. Doors closed without slamming because silence had learned from Marcus. At home, the family dynamic fractured under the weight of accountability. Arguments erupted, then subsided into quiet blame. Her father stopped speaking publicly about legacy and began speaking privately about regret. Her mother withdrew from gatherings, confronting the mirror of her own laughter. Selena navigated a landscape reshaped by truth where love no longer hid behind comfort. She continued writing to Marcus, not asking for forgiveness but documenting change. She volunteered outside her circle, working in environments where respect was earned daily. She learned to speak up when mockery appeared, even when it cost her approval. Marcus observed these changes from a respectful distance, honoring the boundary he set. He believed growth that required an audience was still performance. He waited to see whether accountability endured when no one was watching. Public discourse shifted toward introspection as commentators examined how often humiliation disguised as humor passed unchecked. Workplaces held listening sessions. Families revisited patterns. Leaders questioned the cost of silence. Marcus funded research on ethical leadership and restraint, partnering with universities to study power dynamics in private ownership. The initiative operated quietly, producing frameworks rather than headlines. Students learned that authority rooted in humility lasted longer than authority rooted in fear. The jet incident became a reference point in case studies, not because of the water poured but because of the response withheld. Instructors emphasized the moment Marcus asked whether everyone was finished. That question reframed the entire narrative. Selena requested a longer conversation months later, not to reopen wounds but to acknowledge outcomes. They met again near the river where time softened edges without dulling truth. She spoke about standing up to her family when jokes returned. She described refusing laughter that diminished others. She admitted how difficult it was to unlearn comfort. Marcus listened carefully, noting not the words but the patterns. Consistency mattered more than confession. He said trust was rebuilt by repetition, not intention. They discussed boundaries openly without promises. They agreed to continue separately while allowing respect to remain intact. They accepted that some lessons demanded distance to settle fully. Meanwhile, Marcus made a personal decision to divest from assets that invited spectacle. He sold the jet not from shame but alignment, redirecting resources into programs that expanded access rather than exclusivity. He flew commercially, sat quietly, and observed humanity without hierarchy. He found peace in anonymity. The aviation sale triggered speculation, but Marcus declined comment. Analysts debated motive but missed meaning. Symbols mattered less to him than systems. At a private gathering of mentors, Marcus shared the story without names, focusing on restraint as strategy. He described how silence could be strength when paired with preparation. He cautioned against confusing patience with passivity. The room listened intently. Selina's family attempted public rehabilitation through charity events and statements. The response was muted because sincerity could not be rushed. They learned humility moved at its own pace. Time continued shaping outcomes without negotiation. Marcus's companies grew steadily under governance built on clarity. Employees thrived under leaders who listened. Investors trusted a philosophy that avoided noise. The narrative no longer belonged to the jet or the water. It belonged to what followed quietly afterward. The choices made without witnesses. The standards enforced without announcement. Marcus reflected one evening on the sequence of events, realizing humiliation had revealed truth but restraint had preserved self-respect. He recognized that justice did not require revenge. It required alignment. As the city lights flickered beyond his window, he felt settled. Not vindicated. Not triumphant. Settled. Because the man who owned the jet had chosen not to own the moment. And that choice shaped everything that came after. The final season of Consequence arrived quietly without announcement because real endings rarely needed ceremony. Marcus Hale woke each day grounded in routine, not to escape memory but to anchor intention. He believed consistency was the only language truth understood over time, and he spoke it fluently. The companies under his stewardship continued evolving into systems that protected dignity as fiercely as profit. Board meetings opened with listening sessions. Metrics expanded beyond revenue to include retention, wellness, and ethical outcomes. Leaders learned that authority was measured by what improved when they were absent. Marcus delegated more intentionally, trusting the frameworks he built to function without his presence. He traveled lightly, carrying fewer symbols and more purpose. Airports became classrooms where he observed how people treated one another when no one was watching. The jet incident faded fully into history, replaced by practices that endured. Training manuals cited restraint as a core competency. New hires learned that proximity to power never granted permission to demean. Stories circulated quietly about a moment when laughter met silence and silence prevailed. Selina continued her work without spectacle, choosing spaces where effort mattered more than lineage. She accepted roles that tested her resolve and rewarded consistency. She practiced speaking up when mockery appeared, even when it isolated her. Over time, isolation transformed into respect earned steadily. Her family lived with the slow truth that legacy demanded humility before inheritance. They adjusted to smaller rooms, quieter evenings, and conversations without applause. Regret softened into accountability as patterns were named honestly. The laughter that once filled rooms gave way to listening. Marcus and Selina maintained a respectful distance, meeting occasionally to reflect without expectation. They spoke about values, alignment, boundaries, and the cost of silence. They accepted that love required courage publicly, not comfort privately. They allowed the relationship to exist as learning rather than possession. The public rarely mentioned the story anymore, yet its imprint lingered in private choices. Executives paused before jokes. Families reconsidered laughter at someone else's expense. Leaders recognized how easily power revealed character. Marcus invested in mentorship networks, connecting leaders who valued restraint. He funded fellowships for ethical governance and community stewardship. He supported research that mapped how dignity improved outcomes across organizations. The work progressed quietly, producing tools rather than headlines. One evening, Marcus addressed a closed forum of young leaders sharing principles without names. He spoke about preparation, patience, and the discipline of silence. He described how humility expanded options while arrogance narrowed them. The room absorbed the lesson without applause. Selina attended a separate gathering weeks later, advocating for accountability in family dynamics. She shared how silence could enable harm and how speaking up required practice. Her words resonated because they carried cost. Participants listened closely, recognizing authenticity. Time continued its steady work, aligning outcomes with choices. Marcus's enterprises matured into models studied for resilience. Employees advanced based on merit. Communities benefited from investments that outlasted attention. Marcus walked along the river one night, reflecting on the arc from humiliation to clarity. He acknowledged the pain without revisiting it. He recognized that restraint had preserved something essential. He felt gratitude for the discipline that kept him centered. He returned home to a space defined by simplicity. He read letters from mentor who learned to lead without noise. He archived old documents no longer needed as reminders. He slept peacefully, grounded in alignment. Selena stood at her window elsewhere, contemplating the distance traveled internally. She recognized growth not as redemption but responsibility. She accepted that respect was practiced daily. She continued forward without expectation of return. The family gathered less often and listened more when they did. They learned to question assumptions and measure words. They acknowledged harm without seeking shortcuts. They practiced humility as habit. The world moved on, indifferent and alive. Markets fluctuated. Headlines shifted. New scandals demanded attention. Yet beneath the noise the lesson endured. That ownership without restraint collapsed. That laughter without empathy exposed values. That silence paired with preparation could be power. Marcus Hale continued his work unseen by most, known by those who mattered. He defined legacy as what remained functional, humane and fair after attention left. He chose alignment over spectacle again and again. In the end, the jet was only a setting. The water only a catalyst. The real story lived in what followed quietly afterward. A man chose restraint. A family faced truth. A relationship learned boundaries. A system learned dignity. And the echo of that choice shaped outcomes long after the cabin doors closed.